A world in flux. The turn of the century saw a new dawn of possibilities, both good and bad. Technology reached futuristic proportions, and war was no longer fought only on the battlefield. Masses teemed for human rights. The 19th century had seen the rise of imperialism, and colonial powers had dominated the world's economic and political actions. Classism, racism, and sexism were at their breaking points. Despite this unrest, one of the hallmarks of the early 20th century was the emphasis put on communication and discussion. The invention of the telegraph, and more importantly, the telephone, created ripples in the political and social ideologies of the time. Though they were invented in the previous century, telephones didn't really become popular until the 1900s. These devices revolutionized communication because they allowed immediate contact with people who were someplace else.
Most families had one telephone, and I remember when I got my own telephone, and that was a huge deal. It was my own number, and it wasn't my family number.
Telephones also saw the evolution to cell phones at the end of the century, which further changed communication. Automobiles were another invention that had a tremendous impact on the world at the start of the 20th century. The Ford Model T, which was first produced in 1908, paved the way for a new world that would come to rely heavily on cars. It was the first car that was really affordable, and thus the first one that was really popular.
I remember my mother buying an automobile for $300, a brand new Model T Ford. That was in 1920, I think 1921. I was about 6 years old.
Workers were given few rights and paid very little at the beginning of the century. Around this time, a fire started in the Triangle Shirtwaist factory in New York City. Because the managers had locked the exits of the building, a common practice at that time, no one could escape the fire.
In my senior year, my mother was writing her first oral history, and she interviewed Pauline Newman, a survivor of the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire in 1911, where 146 women and girls lost their lives. It was a landmark in labor history as it galvanized public opinion toward the Labor Party.
In 1912, April 10th, one of that time's largest ships set out on her maiden voyage, carrying over 2,000 passengers. 5 days later, the Titanic hit an iceberg and sank.
Let me tell you, my grandmother was a very avid reader, paid attention to the news. One of the stories that really fascinated her was the Titanic. There were a number of occasions that came up with her talking about it. Of course, it fascinated me to think of a huge ship, a huge ocean liner sinking, especially one that was supposed to be unsinkable.
Though radios had been in use for a while before, they didn't become widely popularized until the 1920s. With the invention of crystal radios and other such devices, the public was able to tune into a new form of entertainment. Radio shows were a common way to both garner news and to be entertained.
I can remember my grandfather having a radio. They called it a crystal set. You could barely hear it, lots and lots of static, but we'd sit around it like it was magic.
The stock market crashed on October 29, 1929, bringing the Roaring Twenties to an abrupt end. Also known as Black Tuesday, this day lives in infamy as the start of the Great Depression, considered the worst economic crisis of modern times. The Great Depression was a devastating event in the world's history that impacted countries rich and poor across the earth. After the stock market crashed, income and profits plummeted, and unemployment rose.
I wasn't aware that we were poor, but my mother made everything. I would maybe get 10 cents a week for an allowance. We colored our own butter. We couldn't afford butter, so we bought what they called Nuco and colored it to make it look like butter and make it in squares. My mother made all of our clothes. We just didn't have a lot.
From 1920 onwards, Prohibition had been in effect. The 18th Amendment to the Constitution prevented the sale, manufacturing, and transportation of most alcoholic beverages. On December 5, 1933, Prohibition was repealed.
At the end of Prohibition in New Orleans, there was a great big parade to celebrate, with beer flowing and all happiness. My dad and his cousin were enthusiastic participants in that parade. Neither one of them were big drinkers, but they just liked the idea.
World War II started in 1939 after Adolf Hitler attacked Poland. Throughout the war, England, the United States, China, Russia, and France all fought against Hitler, attempting to remove the German forces from all occupied land. Hitler had organized concentration camps and removal plans to rid Germany of all Jews, as well as others considered inferior.
Hitler was scary, and on the newsreels there would be Hitler ranting in front of these huge crowds, just hundreds of thousands of Germans, it looked like, just all in sync with him. He's just shouting, and they're hollering back in sync. It was just scary.
As the war continued, more than 6 million Jews were killed. Finally, by 1945, all the concentration camps were freed and Germany surrendered, ending the war in Europe. By May 1945, the German army had surrendered to the Allied powers in World War II. The war was not over yet, though, as Japan refused to surrender. On August 6, 1946, an atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima, immediately killing more than 80,000 people and initiating the Japanese surrender.
My friend Sachiko took me to her home island of Yoranto, which is just north of Okinawa. I met her parents, who were very gracious and happy to give us anything we asked for. I learned only later that Sachiko and her siblings were their parents' second set of children. The first had died under American bombardment.
In 1948, something new came to town. Now, I had read about it. I was a reader of science magazines, popular mechanics, all that kind of stuff, back when I was a little kid. And I had read about this thing called TV that they had in New York City, prior to the Second World War. But nobody in New Orleans had ever seen one. In 1948, lo and behold, the first TV station opens in New Orleans. And let me tell you, everybody was so excited. This was fantastic.
Although TV programming was introduced in some places during the 1940s, TVs became much more popular in the 50s, with many households beginning to own sets during this time. The Cold War started after World War II. It was primarily spurred by the arms race between the Soviet Union and the United States. Because of this conflict, the United States became a breeding ground for anti-communist sentiments. Senator Joe McCarthy, in particular, took charge of persecuting people who he believed to be communist, often without sufficient evidence.
I remember the first daytime TV was the Army McCarthy hearings. The Army McCarthy hearings were when Joe McCarthy was accusing everyone of being communist.
Leading into the 60s, the civil rights movement began to gain ground. Although there were many efforts before this time towards integration and equal rights, mass protesting became more prominent in the 1960s. In 1963, Martin Luther King Jr. organized his March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. Eventually, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was enacted on July 2nd, banning all discrimination.
It changed slowly in New Orleans and throughout much of the South, but it started changing a little bit in the 50s and very much accelerated throughout the 60s. The changes I see today are just astounding. You see friendships that go across races now that you would have never seen then. And there was no way that a bodily white person and a bodily colored person, black person, would have had contact and would have been friends back at the time. I remember the first time I saw an interracial couple was in 1960 in Chicago, and I was kind of shocked by it. But this was the first time I had ever seen a black person and a white person dating. It was a shock. Remember, I grew up when I took the streetcars. I was telling you about before there were movable signs in the streetcars and in the buses that said, "For colored only."
John F. Kennedy, the 35th President of the United States, was assassinated on November 12, 1963 in Dallas, Texas. He was shot while riding in a presidential motorcade. The news caused people to gather in department stores to watch the television coverage, cars to stop in the middle of the road to spread the word, and schools to be released home early.
That was just so shocking. I wasn't particularly a fan of his as far as views and what he did as a president, but to have your president assassinated was a shocking thing.
As a result of the civil rights movement, the integration of public areas, especially schools, was enforced.
I went to school in Jackson, Mississippi in 1974 when integration was being put in place along with busing. I had black and white friends. There was one black kid who would distort money from me. My mom suggested that I invite him over. So he rode his bike across town and we played marbles and my mom made us a snack and after that we were friends.
The desegregation of public schools caused rebellion in the South, involving over 100 congressmen in 1956. They signed the Southern Manifesto, which agreed to use all legal means to find a way around the integration laws. However, integration was eventually enforced. In 1972, America saw the first deep-seated scandal in its political history, Watergate.
I've mentioned my mother and me stuffing mailboxes for George McGovern, Richard Nixon's opponent, and I remember staying up to listen to his acceptance speech at the Democratic Convention. With Watergate, when the Republican Party was caught burglarizing the Democratic National Headquarters, and it later turned out that Nixon was tasing people in the Oval Office, and that later came out in the public hearings Congress held. In 1947, we went to Washington and watched the hearings live. We felt that people, Nixon and his cohort, had corrupted the political process, and the people who were questioning them believed in that process.
NASA launched Columbia, the first space shuttle, in 1981, signaling a new era in cosmic science. It was an exciting event for the future of space exploration and technology. On the night of October 9, 1989, Schabowski, an East German party leader, announced that people would be able to cross the famous wall that divided East Germany from West Germany.
The night the wall came down, I was home. I watched the news and I saw it happen, live. People didn't really think it would happen immediately, but other people took it seriously, so they were able to cross. But I went to sleep because I didn't think anything would happen. In the morning, I realized what happened, and in my class that next morning, the mothers were so excited and told me, and we went to the wall and watched the East Germans.
The reunification of East Germany and West Germany happened throughout the 90s and marked a significant end to the Cold War and the Iron Curtain, with Germany being part of the free capitalist West again. Reunification was not easy.
Overall, people were of course happy to travel. But what gets forgotten is that most people wanted to keep East Germany separate from West Germany and make it an actual socialist state and not a police state. They were excited to be free and have the same material goods and privileges that came with that. But can you imagine being raised in a country and then having your entire country disappear when you were in your late 20s?
My first experience with computers was in 1957 when I was in the Air Force. At that time, a computer that would have had way smaller power than my desktop would have taken up maybe 6,000 square feet, with all the boxes and fans and circuits and cooling and electricity. You know, huge. The advancements since then in technology have been amazing.
Although the computers were available before the 90s, it was this time that saw the widespread adoption of computers for personal public use. Computers have revolutionized data storage, communications, and efficiency. From the invention of the automobile to the advent of the internet, from the labor movement to the civil rights movement, the 20th century was a time period marked by tremendous change. Seen through the eyes of average families, this documentary has provided a glimpse into the 20th century.